That's the power of independent media, to provide a forum for people to speak for themselves. And only when they can't, as in after 9/11, thousands of people, particularly Muslims, Arab Americans, people of South Asian descent, rounded up, arrested. We don't know their names. They didn't know the charges against them. Many of them deported. When they can't tell their own stories, it's our responsibility to tell them until they can tell them for themselves. Which brings us to this last few weeks of the election, with the kind of smearing of a whole population, Arabs, Arab Americans, Muslims. Today we had Isabel McDonald on from Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting. And they have done a report called Smear Casting about those personalities on television. You can't call them journalists, but these personalities who smear whole populations. I don't know about you, but when you have people on these huge podiums, you know, it's called cowards when they don't have to be held accountable for the hate that they spew, what happens on the ground, the increase in hate crimes around the country. What was it that McCain said in the last few days when most of the media hailed him as being decent, trying to stop the campaign of hate against Barack Obama? What was it that he did? A woman stood up at a rally and said she wasn't going to vote for Obama because he was an Arab, right? He was an Arab. And McCain took the microphone. I mean, I'd actually seen what was going to happen to him a week before. One of the Republican strategists said, he'll try this for a week, right? They won't stand up, he and Palin, when people say kill him or traitor. They'll, you know, continue this negative campaigning unless it doesn't work. And they said, if it doesn't work, he'll stop it. And that's what we saw. At the end of the week, this woman says Barack Obama is an Arab, and he immediately takes the mic from her, and he says, exactly, just to get the quote, I don't want to misquote, John McCain, his response to this woman was, no ma'am, no ma'am. He's a decent family man, a citizen. I watched all the Sunday talk shows a few days after that. They all hailed John McCain, that he was standing up. And I thought about what it would have meant if she said, when she said, I got to ask you a question. I do not believe and I can't trust Obama. I've read about him. He's an Arab. What if she had said, I don't believe in Obama. He's a Jew. And if McCain responded, no ma'am, no man, he's a decent family man, he's a citizen. What if this woman had said, I can't trust Obama, he's a Christian. And if McCain had responded, no ma'am, he's a decent family man, he's a citizen. A friend of mine shared a lesson with me that her grandmother had taught her. Her grandmother said, if anyone ever criticizes a person based on the color of their skin or their religion, you're to say, my grandmother is that. You know, my grandmother is a Jew. My grandmother is an Arab. My grandmother is a Christian. My grandmother is a man. Well, whatever. But we have to stand up against all of that. But we also have to stand up for something. And I think the fact is most people in this country are for peace, against war, are for the decent treatment of people even if they are in prison or behind bars. I think most people are against torture in this country. The fact is, those who are opposed to war and those who are opposed to torture are not a fringe minority, not a silent majority, but the silenced majority, silenced by the corporate media, which is why we have to take it back. It is so important that you have WORT here, that you have WYOU here. We have to protect these public spaces where people learn to make their own media, and through that, there's nothing better to deconstruct the media than having to make it yourself, to learn about the media, why it is so important that the city not defund WYOU or fold it into the city station, because this is public access. This is how people, especially young people who don't have resources, don't have the money for cameras or computers, can come in and they can document their own communities, because the truth in one community is a universal truth. We need a media that builds bridges between communities simply by letting people speak for themselves. When you hear a Venezuelan child or a Palestinian mother or an Israeli grandmother or an Iraqi aunt or an Afghan uncle or a kid from the South Bronx, you say, it sounds like my kid, it sounds like my aunt, it sounds like my bubba, it sounds like my grandfather. We need a media that builds bridges, doesn't advocate the bombing of bridges. The media can be a great force for peace. The media are the most powerful institutions on earth, more powerful than any bomb, more powerful than any missile, and the Pentagon's deployed the media, and we have to take it back. It's not good for the generals, it's not good for the low-level soldiers, it's not good for a democratic society. We need an unembedded, independent media. Jeremy talked about what happened at the Democratic and Republican conventions, and it is so important not to, once those events are over with, not to forget about what happened, because they're being used as a model in cities around this country. Well, first, I just want to talk about the conventions themselves, which are supposed to be celebrations of democracy, right? We landed in Denver, the whole Democracy Now! Team, an amazing group of producers and reporters there to document what was happening. We expanded to 2 hours. We called the 2 weeks of broadcast Breaking with Convention, War, Peace, and the Presidency. From the streets to the suites to the convention floor. And that's where we plan to go, everywhere. So we got to Denver, and right before the convention began on Sunday night, we went over to Mile High Station. It was a party place. Party for the party, AT&T threw the party, and it was a party for the Democratic Party, thanking them for what they had done just weeks before, and that was the Democrats joining with the Republicans and granting immunity to the telecoms, to AT&T and Verizon, for spying on the American people. You know, I really do think that lines are breaking down now in this country, that conservative Republicans, like progressives, like independents, like Democrats, like the majority of people in this country, are opposed to corporate control of our lives, deeply care about privacy, and are greatly concerned about the war, which is why this could have been such an important populist issue. You know, spying on American people, we have a gut reaction against this. Yet, inexplicably, the Democrats joined with the Republicans in voting for retroactive immunity for these companies that violated the privacy of the American people. Now, remember, months before, Barack Obama had not only said he was going to oppose it, he'd filibuster it But at the beginning of the summer, they joined together and they passed this law. And right after that, we saw the prototype of the bag that the Democratic delegates would be given, and the media was given. You know, there are thousands of these swag bags that are filled with all sorts of corporate goodies for people who came to Denver, and there was the AT&T logo emblazoned on them. And then we went to Mile High Station for the party that the AT&T was giving to the Blue Dog Democrats, thanking them for what they had done. So, you know, I went up to the security and, you know, was making my way in. Because remember who delegates are. Many of them are legislators, maybe city council, state legislators, congress members, senators. They're elected officials who come together. And a big part of these conventions is the socialization process. Especially young legislators, they learn how politics is done. That's what happens at these conventions. And unfortunately, they're learning business as usual. You often have at these parties more lobbyists than you do legislators. And there's a reason why these corporations spend millions of dollars at these conventions that you will not know what they've spent or who they are, by the way. Because there's a loophole in the Federal Election Commission. And that is that, well, when you give money to a politician or a corporation gives money to a political party or a politician, you can look it up on opensecrets.org and see what they've given, and you should be able to do that. But when it comes to the conventions, under the guise of contributing to the host city, Denver for the Democrats, St. Paul for the Republicans, these corporations can give tens of millions of dollars, and you don't know who gave it and what they gave until 60 days after the convention, which brings us right to the election when it doesn't matter anymore. So over $100 million was spent on these 2 weeks, over $100 million, and we do not know the majority of where this came from or who gave it. But we could see the parties, and there were over 1,000 of them at these conventions. And we felt it was important to go in, to follow the elected officials, see who they're hobnobbing with. The corporations are smart capitalists. They're not going to do this unless they get a payback for it. And they're talking about legislation with the legislators. You know, they might go up to a Vermont legislator and say, you know, that legislation you have around pharmaceuticals is very problematic. Let us hand you a model legislation that we really feel is good for people in your state. So it's important reporters be there. And I tried to get in, but the lobbyists and the delegates were protected by the Mile High security, and I couldn't quite make it there. They kept us far from the party site, so far that you couldn't talk to the delegates who were getting out of limousines and cars or walking over. That was a big problem. Now, we were also given, not only those AT&T bags, our credentials we had hanging around our necks said Quest on them. And the actual plastic that held the Democratic Convention credentials said Vail Resorts on it. At the Republican, and of course the Democratic Convention took place at the Pepsi Center. Not to be outdone, Coca-Cola was emblazoned on both sides of the Republican swag bags. And that convention took place in St. Paul at the Xcel Energy Center, which was bipartisan in its contributions, gave $1 million to both the Democratic and Republican Party pushing nuclear power. They had no worries because both major party candidates support nuclear power. But every aspect of this was corporate. It was astounding to see, and it's not what you see on television. So we went from the Democratic Convention to the Republican Convention. As we flew into St. Paul in the airport, Jon Stewart was on our plane. So we raced over to him in baggage claim to interview him. And as we were interviewing him, I got a text on my phone that said that the Eyewitness Video Collective was being raided in St. Paul. So we raced off to this house in St. Paul. We got the address. It was surrounded by police. The reporters were outside across the street in the front. They couldn't go any further. We didn't know what was happening inside or in the backyard. We heard that the people inside had been brought to the back until the woman next door an African-American family next door to this house. The mother came out and yelled to the press, "Come on in, you got to see what they're doing. You can come through my house and you can look in the back." She said she didn't like what she was seeing and that everyone had to see it. And so we all raced through, and scores of us stood in her backyard looking over the fence at Eileen Clancy, who leads the Eyewitness Video Collective, and the whole crew inside. One of the Democracy Now! Producers, Eileen Press, was there. They were all there, hands handcuffed at the back. And they were all in the backyard. And now we could see. And we had our microphones, we had our cameras, and we were recording this. I don't know if you know what eyewitness video is, but it's well known in New York because they're the ones in 2004 at the Republican convention. Remember when over 1,800 people were arrested, rounded up off the streets of New York as President Bush was giving his second convention speech in 2004. Bloomberg was the mayor. He hopes to be mayor again, challenging term limits in New York. Says these are troubled times and that he needs to be there. But rounded up over 1,800 people. You know, the city knew that they were going to have lots of trouble, lots of lawsuits. They were held for 24, 48, 72, and more hours in these toxic pier sites, all these protesters, but they kept them off the street until Bush spoke. Eyewitness Video was there gathering film of all the police actions in the streets of New York. And the reason they're very well known, and the NYPD, the New York Police Department, certainly knows Eyewitness Video, is that they have been sued I don't know how many times by these people who were falsely imprisoned, who were wrongly arrested. And, well, we, the taxpayers of New York, have had to pay millions upon millions of dollars for their misbehavior. I mean, the police. So many people have sued who were falsely, wrongly imprisoned. And the reason many of them have gotten off, have successfully sued, is because there's this video that challenges the police version of events. When the police say they were doing something, suddenly a video from Eyewitness Video, it pops up in court, and you see an entirely different story. Or the police will present video that looks very damning of a person involved, and then Eyewitness Video shows that the police edited the video and shows the full video, and the judges get very angry. So the New York Police Department knows very well who Eyewitness Video is. And the New York Police Department consulted with both the Denver police and the St. Paul police and the Minneapolis police. So Eyewitness Video comes in to document police behavior and what's happening at the protests. And they're among the first to be detained. It was very frightening. Actually, it was the Glass Bead Collective the week before. A couple of them had come into town. And who are they? They're also a group based in New York. You might remember that videotape a few months ago that came out of a police officer body slamming a cyclist. That was put up by the Glass Bead Collective. So right after that, a few days after that, they make their way to St. Paul. And as they're coming from the bus station, they're detained. Their videotape is taken, their cameras are taken and confiscated. They're surrounded by the police as they come off the Greyhound bus. These are called preemptive raids. Preemptive raids. You know Tom Cruise and that movie Minority Report. I don't usually recommend Tom Cruise's movies, but this one was a good one, right? He's arrested for pre-crimes. That's exactly what's happening here. It should put a chill on everyone. And by the way, good cops need documentation of all that's going on in the streets. Not all cops do the kinds of things that that cop did in body slamming the cyclist, and they don't need to be smeared by bad cops' behavior. And so Glass Bead is taken. Eyewitness Video, they're surrounded. So we're all standing there and watching what's taking place, which is making the police nervous. The FBI first came to the house. The authorities come in with AR-15 automatic weapons, with guns drawn. Elizabeth, our producer at Democracy Now!, was inside with Eileen and the others, and the police moved in, guns drawn. She put the camera above her head. She was afraid they would mistake it for a gun, and they're taken out. Their stuff is all tossed, thrown out of their bags. You know, they've just come into the house, and they're handcuffed in the backyard. The owner of the house, who hardly knew Eyewitness Collective, he's there handcuffed as well. He's one of the first people now to have sued the St. Paul police. He is completely shocked. He's lived there for years, good neighbor of this family next door that invited everyone to go through their house, and he's sitting there handcuffed as well. He's completely shocked, and finally a lawyer comes to the backyard. She's representing the owner. And I say to her, he's your client? Could I go interview him? And she said, sure, if he's willing. So we jump over the fence. I'm there with our cameraman, Hanny, and the police immediately start pushing us back. And they tell Hanny he's got to move. And he said, I can't. She'll fire me. I am following orders. And he said to the police officer, you know what that means. We have to follow orders. So anyway, because all the press was there, microphones on, you know, cameras filming, this meant that this event was over, that the detention was over. And this is the power of the media when they're able to shed the spotlight in a direction, right? So all of a sudden, they go from being detained for hours, and they're, as inexplicably as the police moved in, they're released. And we move on to cover the Republican convention. That was Saturday. On Monday is the first day of the convention, and the morning was a very touching scene of over 10,000 people marching against the backdrop of the St. Paul Capitol, the Capitol building. Thousands of people marching for peace to the Xcel Energy Center, led by the Iraq veterans against the war, led by men and women who had been in Iraq, who had been in Afghanistan, and were saying no to war. And after that major protest in the morning, a brilliant blue, beautiful, warm day, the Democracy Now! Team went back to the offices. We were broadcasting out of St. Paul Neighborhood Network, SPNN. First time they were going global with these 2-hour broadcasts. And I went off to the convention floor to interview delegates from the hottest state of Alaska. And I got a call on my cell phone, and I was there with Rick Rowley of Big Noise Films, and Mike Burke, one of our producers, says Sharif Abdul-Qaddus and Nicole Salazar are being arrested. He said he thinks they're hurt. And I was completely surprised. First of all, I thought the protest was over. I thought they were in the offices, but they had actually heard a commotion outside as they were digitizing tape, and they ran out camera in hand to document, to do their job. So we raced to the streets of St. Paul. We heard they were at 7th, on the corner of 7th, which was a big parking lot. And we raced there, and at this point, the riot police had completely contained the area. And so we ran up to the riot police, and I just went up to them. You know, I had my credentials on. These are credentials. They're like top security credentials. They allow me to interview presidents and vice presidents and senators and congressmen, you know, on the floor of the convention. And I said to them, you know, our two producers, you really want to get folks before they're put in the police wagon and they're processed, because then it's very hard. I already knew it from New York in 2004. You might not get people out for the entire week. It's very important to get this at the beginning. And so I ran up to them and I said, you know, I'm a credentialed reporter. You can see my credentials. And we have two producers inside. They're credentialed reporters. We need to have them released immediately. Can I talk to the commanding officer? And they just ripped me through the police line, and they twisted my arms behind my back, and they put those rigid plastic handcuffs on that, you know, cut into your wrist, and they pushed me up against the wall, and then they pushed me down on the ground. This happened so fast, within seconds. Now that video, the 49-second video, was viewed on YouTube more than any other video that week. But it was Nicole's video that was more chilling. I just knew, I was desperate to make sure that Sharif and Nicole were okay. So I was down on the ground. It looked like a war zone in this parking lot. It was unbelievable. People's head was wrapped in gauze. I saw a young person handcuffed and throwing up on the pavement. And then I saw Sharif across the parking lot. He was standing there, his hands behind his back. He was handcuffed, his credentials around his neck, and his arm was bleeding. I was demanding to see Nicole. I couldn't find her anywhere. I was very concerned about her. And finally, they brought me over to Sharif. And we're both standing there, our hands behind our back. And I am loudly proclaiming that we are journalists. This is an outrage. They should release us now. This is unacceptable. They could see our credentials. Whereupon the Secret Service came over and they ripped the credentials from around my neck. They had taken Sharif's credentials as well. I said, you have to at least give me a receipt, because, you know, when police take things from you, you're supposed to get a receipt. They took my jacket. I never got that back, but I wanted those credentials. And they just walked away. We were arrested. I was arrested by the Minneapolis police. You know, they were together with the St. Paul police. You had the Secret Service, the riot police, every level. We had been told, you know, there were a lot of National Guard, not right there, but around the convention center, who were just back from Fallujah. There was every level of military and security. This is called National Special Security, National Special Security event. And you have to start asking questions about is this the end of Posse Comitatus, you know, not having the military in the streets of the United States, especially because military have now been deployed all over the United States beginning October 1st. And for those of you who didn't hear the debate between Northcom spokesperson and Matt Rothschild, right, editor of the Progressive magazine, on Democracy Now! Last week or the week before, go to democracynow.org, because it's very chilling. But so I'm standing there with Sharif. He's bleeding. Our credentials are ripped off. And then they go, after processing me, they charge me with a misdemeanor. I think it was interfering with a peace officer. If only they were acting as peace officers. And then I'm taken to the police wagon, and there is Nicole inside. Her face had been bloodied, her hands were behind her back, she was handcuffed, and there are her credentials around her neck. It's all very clear who we are. And Nicole tells me what happened. You know, they had run down because they heard a commotion outside. There were protesters, and the riot police moved in very, very fast in pincer-like fashion. They're coming at Nicole very quickly. She was filming. They're in a parking lot, so she's trapped by the parked cars. They're coming at her very fast with their batons, as Jeremy described. And as they're coming at her, she's shouting, "Press, press." Maybe that was her problem to have said that. And she's showing her credential, "Press, press." And the police are moving in. The riot police are all in black, new gear, top to bottom. And they are shouting, "Face on the ground, face on the ground." And they're telling her to move, and she's saying, "Where?" She's trapped. And they push her down on the ground, her face in the ground. They've got a boot or a knee in her back, and they're dragging on her leg, which is bloodying her face. And what's one of the first things they do is pull the battery out of her camera, if you had any question about what they wanted to accomplish here. That was Nicole. You know, in a situation like this, where, you know, these armed men are taking down this young woman between two parked cars, you really hope there's a police officer around. You want a police officer who will arrest the assailants. But the problem was that the police were the assailants, and they were arresting their victim. But ultimately, the victim is democracy. Because when you beat and arrest journalists, you're closing the eyes and ears of a democracy. There's a reason why our profession, journalism, is the only one explicitly protected by the US Constitution, because we're supposed to be the check and balance on power. We're supposed to be holding those in power accountable. So there is Nicole down on the ground. She's handcuffed. Sharif is there. He's a very calm guy. He sees all this go down, and he is telling the police to calm down. And they take him and they throw him up against the wall. They kick him twice in the chest. They take him down. They bloody his arm, and they arrest him, and they handcuff him. They're both charged with PC felony riot. That's a probable cause felony riot. Who was rioting here? So we're brought in the police wagon. I'm brought to the police garage where the protest cages are. And Sharif and Nicole, because I'm charged with a misdemeanor, Sharif and Nicole are taken to jail because they face felony charges. But there's such an outcry. We didn't know this inside the jails, but there's such an outcry outside. And thanks to Jeremy and to Mike Burke and the whole Democracy Now! Team and all the people that were getting word out about what was happening, there was such a tremendous outcry that we ultimately were released that night. So I was asked by some of the networks to come and describe what happened. So I went into the convention center later that night. I had the arrest band around my arm. And I was in one of the skyboxes describing what was happening. An NBC guy was doing a stand-up next to me, and he's just listening to me describe what happened. And he came over to me, he said, I've covered like 300 protests, over the years. I don't understand. I didn't get arrested here. And I said, oh, were you outside? And he said, well, no. I said, well, that's the thing. I'm not getting arrested in the skybox either. And I said, and I'm not getting arrested on the convention floor. As Woody Allen says, 90% of life is just showing up. So if you go outside, that's the problem. And I just saw some folks here who were describing the next day when they were out, part of a protest. And they were marching along, by the Capitol. And they were looking at this monument as they were getting tear gassed that said, "Blessed are the peaceful." There's a monument right there outside the St. Paul Capitol. Blessed are the peaceful. We have to live by these ideals, not just carve them in stone and then stone those who dare to dissent. So that was Monday night, and Tuesday morning, the police chief held a news conference, St. Paul Police Chief John Harrington. So we raced over to cover the news conference, and the police officer who opened the door to the news conference was the officer that processed me the night before. So I said to him, you not only have to let me in, you have to let me out when the press conference is done. So we went into the press conference, and I asked the police chief, John Harrington, what have you instructed your police to do here? And how are we supposed to operate as press? I described the whole scene, what happened to Sharif, what happened to Nicole. This was outrageous. This was unacceptable. And he responded we could embed with the mobile field force. Embed. Next day, Rick Rowley is out filming the riot police, and right in the middle with a baseball cap is Fox News, embedded with the riot police. Now, you know what they mean, embed with the police. Embed as they did in Iraq, as they've done in Iraq, right? The reporters embed in the front lines of troops, which gives you one perspective when you're sleeping with, eating with, when your life is in the hands of the people you're covering, you're going to bring one perspective. If you're going to have your reporters embedded there, what about being embedded in Iraqi hospitals? What about being embedded in Iraqi communities and the peace movement around the world? I was recently interviewed by a public radio reporter, and one of the questions she asked me was, but when these people go out and protest, they're doing this to get press attention. Why should you just give in to that? And I said, and when a senator holds a press conference, why do you think he's doing that? To get press attention. And you don't ask questions, you sign up for the press conference. What is wrong with trying to make a point? The reason protesters gather by the thousands is because when one of them stands up, no one's going to cover them unless, of course, you have independent media. So the best they can hope for is when there are thousands or tens of thousands, or like February 15th, 2003, the month before the invasion, 1 million people on a freezing cold day. The best they can hope for is maybe a CBS executive or producer will have opened the window in their overheated offices, and hopefully the sound of this protest will waft in and hit one of the corporate microphones by chance. That's why people gather together. So you have the protesters outside, and you have the delegates inside. And the thing is, both in the Democratic and Republican conventions, they do have one message. They want to put out sort of one watchword, one idea every day. And that's the convention floor. That's what's coming from the podium. And that is a part of the story. But democracy is a messy thing. And it's not just that message that we're supposed to be covering. There's the story in the convention. There's the story in the corporate suites and covering who's sponsoring the parties, who's going to them, and who is not allowed in. And there's a story on the streets, and it's our job to cover all of this. Let us not have that highly problematic model of reporters embedded in the front lines of troops in Iraq be the model for how we report on American cities. Now, there is a serious question raised, the question of does it matter who is the President of the United States? There is no question that that person occupies the most powerful position on earth. And what that person does, what that person says matters to people in this country and to people all over the world. Years ago, I was interviewing a woman from Guyana about the effects of globalization. And we were sitting in the studio, and at the end of the conversation, I thanked her, the music swelled, and that's when we usher out one guest and bring in another, and we were going to be talking about the US elections, and she just sat there. I said, actually, we have new guests that are coming in now, but thank you so much. And she said, no, I will be a part of this conversation. And I said, why? You're from Guyana. We're talking about the US elections. And she said, I believe everyone in the world should get to vote for President of the United States. Why? Because what that person does matters, affects people everywhere. Well, she doesn't get to vote in US elections, and you do. You have an awesome responsibility this November. Yes, what that single person does, what he utters, what he says, the policies he institutes absolutely matter, but there is a force more powerful. And that is all of you, all together with people all over this country. There is nothing more powerful than movements that move these people. And that's why the most important thing you can do is make demands. You know, Frederick Douglass said, power concedes nothing without a demand. Yes, it matters what you say, what you think, what you demand of these candidates, and ultimately of the man who will be president. It matters. You think about what is happening in this election and the stakes, how high they are. For example, the execution date has just been set for Troy Anthony Davis in Georgia. He is scheduled to die on October 27th. And I wanted to point out Liliana Segura in the front row, who is a fierce anti-death penalty activist. You may read her work on Alternet, and it's very, very important. She has been following his case, has been on Democracy Now!, talking about his case. His sister, a remarkable woman, Troy Anthony Davis' sister. You know, this is the case of a man who, in 1991, was in a parking lot, saw a man being pistol whipped. As the story has now unfolded and been described by many, went to intervene. Then a security guard off-duty police officer went and intervened. The security guard, the police officer off-duty, was shot. They charged Troy Anthony Davis with the murder. Now 7 of the 9 non-police witnesses have recanted their testimony. He has been scheduled to die twice. This will be the 3rd time. The Supreme Court intervened this time, but earlier this week said that the execution could go forward, and now the state of Georgia has set the date. It is very frightening. His sister, Martina Correa, is a remarkable woman. She has been fighting for her own life for almost as long as she's been fighting for Troy's. She has breast cancer. She is very famous in the streets of Georgia because the breast cancer mobiles to get people to get mammograms have her face in it. And she was just recently honored in New York as one of the stars, along with Nancy Pelosi, the House Speaker, by the Breast Cancer Coalition. And she will not let, I was going to say the story die, her brother die. But this is very grave, what's about to happen, October 27th, unless some miracle takes place. And I do call grassroots action miracles, but John Lewis has spoken out, the congressman, the great civil rights leader from Georgia. Jimmy Carter, the former president, has spoken out, one person after another. The problem with the death penalty in this country, among other problems, is that innocence is not necessarily grounds to stop an execution. And another problem is that the 2 major party candidates agree on the issue of the death penalty. They are both for the death penalty. But they can change. Listen to Barack Obama in the last debate. I actually was very relieved at the end of the 3rd presidential debate that happened the other night, just about an hour from where we broadcast at Hofstra and Hempstead. Because at the end of that debate that I listened to for 90 minutes, I felt this weight lifted. My God, maybe we're not involved with 2 wars. Did they mention war? I think when Barack Obama was saying something about Biden, he might have twice mentioned war. And John McCain might have once said one of his objections to Biden was he was against the Persian Gulf War. But other than that, there was no mention of war. I mean, what could be a more serious act than a country waging war on another? We have to make these issues at the forefront, as the Iraq veterans against the war have done at every demonstration, every protest standing there. And that's our job in the media. You know, when President Bush invokes the executive order that says you can't film, videotape, photograph the flag-draped coffins of soldiers coming home, that's what we have to do. We have to present the pictures. We have to show the images. And Standing Up to the Madness, the book that I wrote with my brother David Goodman, we tell the story of ordinary citizens in this country, citizens and non-citizens, just everyday people who don't go looking for trouble, but when trouble comes to them, they stand up. And that is the hope. Like a group of people you would not want to meet in the middle of the night if you were hijacking someone's civil liberties, and they are the librarians of this country. I feel the presence of librarians, but I've never heard a librarian raise her or his voice, so I'm a little bit disoriented here. But I mean, it's an amazing story. We have this chapter called Librarians Unbound. And it's a story of the librarians of Connecticut a few years ago when the USA Patriot Act was being reconsidered by the US Congress. And how 2 FBI agents came to the office of the Library Connection. It's the computers that connect the libraries of Connecticut. And the executive director was a guy named George Christian. He opens the door, there's 2 agents there, and they hand him an NSL. That's a national security letter. Over 150,000 people have received these in the country. I'm sure it's well over 200,000 at this point. He opens this letter. When you open an NSL, it's like being exposed to radioactivity. You are then contaminated. You can't tell anyone you've gotten this letter, not your boss, not your colleague, not your partner, no one, on pain of 5 years in prison. And he looks at it, and it's a national security letter that demands information about patrons who use the library within the computer system, that use the computers within the library system at a certain time on a certain day. And George Christian looks up, because librarians do care about their patrons' privacy. And he looked up at the FBI agents and he said, I believe this is unconstitutional. The FBI agents looked at him pityingly like a predator sizing up his prey. And they handed him their cards, and they said, you get back to us. So he closes the door, and then he sits down, and this very brave librarian crumples into his seat, and he thinks, oh my God. He thinks, if I'm going to take on the US government, I need at least 4 other librarians. And he doesn't even know if he's allowed to tell anyone, even his own lawyer, and that is the point. He calls up Peter Chase. He's head of the Plainville Library. David and I visited Peter Chase, the library director of Plainville. We recognized him when we went to see him. He was the guy with the pocket protector. And he called Peter and the others. Peter had just been asked to serve on the Library Connection board. It's a voluntary position, and they said they'd make him vice president if he would serve. He could serve for a year. They said it would be easy. So he and the other members of the board, George Christian called, said, I need you in my office tomorrow morning at 9. Don't tell anyone where you're going or what this is about. Not that they knew what this is about. Peter Chase is racing off the next morning thinking, what on earth? And a secret emergency meeting of the Library Connection? What, did someone not return a library book? Did someone misfile an adult book in the children's section? And they go to this meeting. The pro bono lawyer is there. She immediately runs out and she says, this is way over my head. You have to call the ACLU. George Christian shows them the NSL, so they're all exposed. And they decide to sue the US government to try to take down the USA Patriot Act. Well, it's quite a remarkable story what they went through. When their case was heard in the Bridgeport, Connecticut court, they were not allowed to go into that courtroom. They lost their names. They were called John Doe, Connecticut. Peter Chase was one of the leading advocates against the USA Patriot Act. He was always debating the US attorney in Connecticut. And suddenly, the US attorney was involved with the serving of these NSLs. His debating partner, his sparring partner, Peter Chase, could no longer speak because he didn't want to lie to anyone. He's afraid people would say, are you involved with this John Doe librarian versus the USA Patriot Act? So he couldn't debate anymore, and the US attorney just ran around advocating for the USA Patriot Act. When the case was heard in a Bridgeport court, the librarians were not allowed in. They were brought to the Hartford court, and they were locked in a security closet. No one was more surprised than the guard who locked them in. He said, I'd never locked librarians in a closet before. And they were put in this closet because there was a closed-circuit TV that looked at the courtroom over the shoulder of the judge. And there, what warmed their hearts, these 4 brave souls, these 4 freedom fighters of our time, was seeing the courtroom packed with librarians from across the country. Well, they weren't allowed to reveal who they were, but amazingly, the government forgot to redact some documents that were released, and there was Peter Chase's name and Library Connection. I think AP called his house, and New York Times called his house, and his kid, high school student, comes running out. His dad's coming home from the library one day. He says, Dad, these reporters have called, and their son, he said, you didn't get that call, and you will not repeat that to anyone. And he said, but they were talking about like you're involved in some case. Dad, are you involved with drugs? And Peter Chase calls his lawyer and he says, he's sort of chuckling, he says, I can't believe we have had to keep our names secret, and now the government released, can you believe it? Now the reporters have called, and there's silence on the other end. And the lawyer says, Peter, this isn't funny. It doesn't matter if the librarians called you or if the reporters called you or you called the reporters. This isn't what matters. What matters is there is a record of this call. You have to leave the house now, and you can't stay in one place more than one night at one time now. So now these librarians are not only gagged and muzzled, but they are on the run. Ultimately, they did not win their case, but right after the USA Patriot Act was renewed, the muzzle was lifted, the gag was lifted, and they're the only 4 people who can talk about being served with a national security letter. If there was any question about why this gag was imposed, Just think about why it was that as soon as the USA Patriot Act was passed, they would have testified before Congress against it. Their gag was lifted. Yes, these are the freedom fighters of our time. There is hope in this country. Or kids, high school kids, also in Connecticut, in Wilton High, who are performing a play about war based on the writings and the words of soldiers who've come back from Iraq or are in Iraq and writing letters home. Here they put together their words with their teacher, Bonnie Dickinson, who's the drama coach at Wilton High, and they're going to perform the play as they do every year, an annual play. And the principal comes in and he says, you can make your costumes, you can make your set for the play, but you can't perform it on the Wilton High School stage. And they say, why not? He says, it's too controversial. They beg him, they plead, they get angry, and he says, that ship has sailed. And that sails them right onto the New York stage because theaters in New York hear about the censorship and they invite the kids to perform in New York. And these kids do what actors dream of all their lives, perform on the New York stage. They do it at the Culture Project at the New York Public Theater. And what's most poignant at the Public Theater is in the audience among the hundreds of theater goers are some of the soldiers whose words they're dramatizing. It's absolutely beautiful what took place, talking about an education for these kids. Ira Levin, the playwright and author, the late playwright, he just recently died, wrote a letter to the New York Times when this piece was written up about the censorship. And he wrote The Stepford Wives. Ira Levin wrote in his letter that he grew up in Wilton, Connecticut, and The Stepford Wives was based on his experience there. He congratulated the kids for not being Stepfordized. We also write, and I think what's so important and what is really the hope is in every sector of society we're seeing these levels of resistance. You know, the global warming scientists like Jim Hansen, leading climatologist in the world. And he is finding himself, after he says at the end of 2005, it's been the warmest year in a century, that the Bush administration says the problem is not global warming, it's Jim Hansen. And they hire this 23, 24-year-old kid named George Deutsch, brought in to monitor what Jim Hansen says to the press. What kind of reports get out from this leading climatologist in the world? And then Jim Hansen finds himself testifying before Congress about the censorship. And what is George Deutsch's qualifications to decide what kind of research gets out on global warming, these words, global warming, that are being vacuumed off government websites? We can talk about severe weather, as the networks do, or extreme weather, but dare to put those two words together, global warming, and they'll get erased, as they so often have. What were George Deutsch's credentials, this 24-year-old kid? He was an intern in the 2004 Bush-Cheney war room for their re-election campaign. But these scientists got word out because they're talking about the fate of the earth, and people do care. And then we talk about psychologists in denial, an amazing story of psychologists within the American Psychological Association, the largest association of psychologists in the world, 150,000 of them. But why do you join the APA if you're a psychologist? Usually just to get insurance. You know nothing about the politics of the association. And it turns out that psychologists, unlike the American Psychiatric Association, American Medical Association, the American Psychological Association, was allowing its members to be involved in coercive interrogations at places like Guantanamo. It's astounding. When the AMA and the American Psychiatric Association said no, the Pentagon relied wholly on the psychologists, the American Psychological Association, and those outside, the APA as well. And these dissident psychologists inside said no. And they started to withhold their dues. They started to organize inside. They started to challenge the leadership, introduce a resolution to stop, to bar, to put a moratorium on psychologists' involvement at Guantanamo. And the leadership would not budge. They voted it down. And then one psychologist realized by examining the bylaws of the association that he didn't even care about that much. But looking at the bylaws, he saw we don't have to go through the leadership. We can introduce a referendum that will be voted on by the grassroots of this association. And they just voted to stop psychologists from participating in coercive interrogations. And the new president of the APA, though he was not necessarily for this, has said he will institute this immediately and has written a letter to the president. The leading dissident psychologist, a man named Dr. Stephen Reisner, a New York psychoanalyst, is now running for president of the APA. The votes are taking place as we speak on the internet, and he got the most nominating votes for president. It is astounding what people can do when they see that something that has come to represent them is wrong. Not people looking for trouble, but when it comes to them, doing something about it. And I'm just going to end with these two quick stories. We begin with Rosa Parks. And you might ask, why would we talk about Rosa Parks? Yes, she is a very brave woman who launched the modern-day civil rights movement, who launched Dr. Martin Luther King with the Montgomery bus boycott. But we all know her story. Well, the fact is the media gets it wrong every time they tell it. December 1st, 1955, she sits down on the bus in Montgomery, and in so doing, and in refusing to get up for a white passenger, she launched the Montgomery bus boycott. Well, when she died a few years ago, Democracy Now! Raced to Washington. Her body, she was the first African-American woman to lay in state in the rotunda. Then her body was brought to a Washington church. Thousands turned out for the memorial service before the funeral in Detroit. And the media, when they told her story, they said Rosa Parks was simply a tired seamstress. She was no troublemaker. Yes, she was a first-class troublemaker. Rosa Parks was the secretary of the local NAACP in Montgomery. She worked with E.D. Nixon. He came out of radical labor politics. He was the president of the NAACP. They've been challenging the racist laws for years. She trained at the Highlander Center in Tennessee. I'm going to Memphis tomorrow. She trained at the Highlander Center, black and white together, to change the laws of this country. She knew exactly what she was doing when she sat down on this bus. Now, there were women who sat down on the bus in Montgomery before Rosa. But this was the magic moment. And you never know when that moment's going to come. In fact, Rosa sat down on the bus before December 1st in the front of the bus. But this was the magic moment. And that's why it is so important you be involved today in this absolutely critical year. And that it should not, that activism cannot stop in 2008. This is just where it should begin, or you continue your work. Because you never can tell when that magic moment will take place. It's often over something much smaller than you think would change the world. But when that moment happens, if you have helped to lay the foundation, you can direct the course of history. That's why it's so important that you be involved, that the future of the world rests on your shoulders, but your shoulders joining together with so many other people are so much stronger than one individual. And so on December 1st, 55, when she sat down on the bus and refused to get up, and that night her friend Joanne Robinson, another African-American woman activist. See, the media denigrates activists. What could be more noble than dedicating your life to making the world a better place? Joanne Robinson mimeographs off 35,000 flyers to begin the bus boycott. Is mimeograph a word anyone understands anywhere more? And then 4 days later, December 5th, when Rosa Parks is going to court, the Montgomery Improvement Association meets. They choose as their leader to lead the boycott a young minister who's just come into town. It's Dr. Martin Luther King. Rosa Parks helped to launch Dr. Martin Luther King. And to show how brave Rosa was in doing what she did, just go back a few months to the summer of 1955, Emmett Till, 14-year-old boy. His mother, Mamie Till, sends him down to Money, Mississippi to be with family for the summer. And he's lynched, he's killed, he's tortured, he's mutilated by this white gang, not fully investigated to this day. He ends up in the bottom of the Tallahatchie River. They say he wolf whistled at a white woman, 14 years old. And when his body is sent up to Chicago, his mother, Mamie Till, does something quite revolutionary. She says she wants the casket open for the world to see the ravages of racism, the brutality of bigotry. Thousands stream by his coffin. Jet Magazine and other black publications photograph his distended head. And those images are seared into the consciousness and history of this country. Mamie Till Mobley did something very important. She has something to teach the press of today. Show the pictures, show the images. Could you imagine if for just 1 week we saw the images of war still today? Yes, those wars are going on. In Iraq, in Afghanistan, we saw the babies dead on the ground. We saw the women with their legs blown off by cluster bombs. We saw the soldiers dead and dying for just 1 week. Americans are a compassionate people. They would say, no, war is not the answer to conflict in the 21st century. Democracy Now!